Thank you very much, Chris and Naveen. Now for the panel discussion, I would also like to introduce our panelists, the further panelists, Ringatani Ndlovu, Salim Teba, and Razia Ghani. And Chris, thanks for joining us on the panel discussion. Chris, I really found your presentation very insightful, but I actually want to start with Razia first. Razia, so maybe you can elaborate more in terms of the type of client needs and challenges that you're currently facing and trying to solve for.
Thanks very much, Rodrigo. So yes, I mean, we're always facing a number of challenges. I think one of the fairly constant challenges is market volatility, how to manage it and how to manage client expectations of it. More recently, the infrastructure draft came out, the Reg 28 draft, which focused predominantly on infrastructure. So that's become quite a topical issue. And then, of course, some of the more permanent issues are ESG and impact investing, which I think have been on trustees' minds for quite a while now. Issues like how to access this, how to do more in the ESG space. Most funds are focused predominantly on the G within the ESG, environmental, social, and governance. So they focus on the G because that's been a bit simpler, specifically for smaller funds. A few more have been able to access the E and the S in some form. NMG Consulting, which is our global counterpart, have done an ESG study where they spoke to over 230 asset allocators and asset owners. And concerns were quite different to what we find locally. You know, they've been doing this for a number of years in the developed market space, more than 10 years for a lot of those funds. And what they found was one of the things that I thought was quite interesting was where they were asked about why they include ESG, the overwhelming response was that it was to enhance returns and risk, which is interesting because one of the issues we have here is that people are still questioning whether, what the merits are of this in terms of risk and return. So those are just some of the issues. I mean, we're also now starting to think about climate change and how to take that into account within portfolios. How do we start thinking about 2-degree economies, 1.5-degree economies? How do we actually take that into account within portfolios? So those are some of the current things that we're thinking about.
Thanks, Roger. Now, that's really a great scene setter. I think let's start on infrastructure. It's actually, I agree, it's been a very much talked about topic, but it's been very focused on renewable energy per se. I'm just wondering if one shouldn't actually be thinking about it a little bit broader. So, Solly, maybe if I can turn to you, what has your fund experience been in infrastructure, and how do you think should one not think about it a little bit broader than just renewable energy?
Well, thank you, Ridico. I think as a fund, we are very passionate about new developments, especially something that has got an impact towards our membership. But to start with, as far as renewables are concerned, we've been in that space for quite some time now. It took us quite a long time to accept to go into the renewable space because of obviously the issues with ESCOM and all those politics. But ultimately we settled for that, and now we are very happy. We are almost into the renewables in terms of 4 different kinds, if I'm not mistaken. We are into solar, we are into wind, we are into water. We've got one project that we visited in December last year, hydropower electric project. We are also into something called plastic green energy. We didn't even know about that. And as far as the locations are concerned, the water one is in the Free State, along the Ash River. The wind one is in the Eastern Cape. Solar is in the Northern Cape. So I think in terms of those projects, we are making a huge impact in underdeveloped areas. Job creation is just ticking up, and that's what we like as a fund. And as far as other spaces of infrastructure are concerned, I think there's a lot that can still be done. If you look into the outlying provinces in South Africa, outside Gauteng, outside the Western Cape, you can go deeper into the rural towns, and there's a huge need there of sewer systems, water, infrastructure, reticulation, bulk, whatever. So, because there's also a lot of mining activities in those provinces, and mines need a lot of water. And mines also can also use recycled water. So you can also go into recycling sewer water and pumping it back to the mines for their operations. So I think there's still a huge need there. And we're hoping asset managers can explore those spaces. When they come to talk to us, they can then come and introduce new projects in that line.
Solina, that's great guidance, because you're really saying get into renewable energy because it's needed by the country, but it can actually be far broader because the country's got broader needs.
Yes.
So, Raja, I want to turn back to you. So, you also mentioned Regulation 28, and there's been quite a lot of industry feedback on it. So maybe just highlight what your thoughts are, or summarize what you thought, what you think the shortcomings really are, and what needs to be addressed before we can all embrace this change.
So there was quite a lot of comments that were provided for the regulation, for the draft regs, from a number of different industry bodies. I was involved with the CFA, Society of South Africa, comments, and there was a number of comments around additional debt being included rather than equity exposure. I think currently, as it stands, there's more equity exposure allowed than debt. But most infrastructure projects are generally debt-based. So that was one of the comments. There's also no minimum exposure, which I think was a good thing, because otherwise, this would come across as a prescription. But the infrastructure does offer an additional source of returns, which is quite different to what we normally see in traditional asset classes available. So there may be potential issues around how smaller pension funds can participate in this asset class, so to speak. So yeah, those were some of the comments. I mean, a number of the other things related to the definition being mainly around government projects. And we hope that when the final comes out, it might be more of a collaboration between private and government. But yeah, so there was quite a number of that was two of the fairly bigger ones. So more debt than equity, and then I guess a conundrum from a client perspective is how to access this if you're a smaller fund.
No. Thanks, Raja. I'm going to pick up later on that sources of return that you mentioned. Maybe to ask Ringi, just in terms of from a manager experience perspective, because Solly mentioned water, PV, solar PV, and wind, etc. So what has your experience been, and maybe also to come back to that, the source of return, or how can it actually be beneficial to a client's solution?
Yeah, thanks, Rudigal. That's a really good question. So I think from our experience, typically the type of investments that we see more frequently are targeted in the renewable energy space. So, the solar projects in the Northern Cape, as Solly mentioned, as well as the wind projects in the Western Cape. And I think, there are a lot of good learnings to take out of the renewable energy program. You've got a project finance type of a structure, you've got offtake agreements, you've got guarantee structures, and I think most importantly, you've got a CPI-linked investment over a 15-year term, over hard infrastructure. And so that's a great asset liability match for pension funds. And I think it's a model that can be looked at replicating for other asset classes or other hard infrastructure.
Maybe I can also just make a comment, because it links back to what Raja was saying, is in terms of from an accessibility perspective, us as House is really trying to solve for liquidity and getting infrastructure really listed so that that it's not just available to the very large pension funds or provident funds, but actually to a broader array of investors. But I think that's something that will still take a little bit of time to get to. I kind of feel that if one talks about infrastructure, one needs to actually a little bit broaden it, the discussion, to actually rather talk about impact, and because I think impact is a far broader topic. Sorry, Raja, I'm going to again turn to you. Maybe you can just elaborate a little bit more in terms of where you see the greatest need lie for your member or for your client.
Okay. As a municipal fund, I think my experience, and I believe it's an experience across the whole country, is that members don't necessarily come from Gauteng. They don't come from the bigger cities. Members come from the provinces that I've mentioned. And the biggest need for them is, number one, housing. We've been struggling to get projects that are aimed at alleviating the housing shortage for our members that we can sort of invest in. There's just no creativity as far as that is concerned, and our members have been crying loud about that. Not the so-called pension-backed loan model. They don't like that. But then the second need is obviously in job creation, because members are saying, yes, we're investing in these funds, we're going to have a nice retirement amount when we retire, but what about our kids? They can't get jobs, they can't get employment, so my pension is going to support me and my kids, so it's not going to be sufficient. So job creation is also a great concern for our members. Lastly, I would say health care, because if you look at, like I said, our members don't necessarily come from Gauteng. When they go to their areas during Christmas, your Easter long weekends, they need the same, more or less the same health facilities that they find here, or they can access here while in Gauteng. Because number one, they've got medical aid, and a well-subsidized medical aid for that matter. But what does it help if you go outside Gauteng and there's no private hospital where you can go with your medical aid and get better healthcare facilities? So I think if we can start moving into those as well, our members will be happy.
Thanks, Solly. Razi, your thoughts?
Yes, I think, in South Africa, we've always had low savings rates, but we have quite a very demographic. So I think a lot of solutions that might have worked abroad may not necessarily work as well or as easily in South Africa, and needs to be adapted in some ways. And we can see that from the recent change where they allowed are forcing preservation, but with some caveats. So there are circumstances where you can actually withdraw from your fund as you move jobs, etc., which is something you wouldn't find abroad, where actually your money's tied up until you retire. So they've had to make some changes for South Africa, given our specific requirements. I think some of the difficulties we find is we have such a broad variety of members in one fund, and they all have different priorities. It does become quite difficult to cater for every single need. We try to cater for the majority of members, but I think we are able to make investments that actually have a positive impact for future generations, but are still meeting current objectives and returns, that speaks to members. Because exactly as Sally mentioned, we need to start thinking about future generations and what's going to be left for them, which comes through in impact investment and climate change, etc., which is all about making sure that returns are sustainable, and into the future we're actually able to have a decent world to retire into. So yeah, I think we've got a number of challenges. From my perspective, I think it's important that we just start looking at it and trying to tackle them, rather than thinking, oh, it's such a big problem, and end up doing nothing. So
Yeah, and Razi and I agree. One needs to take that first step, and I think it's quite a lot of investors are asking for help and assistance with that first step, because it's very much an educational thing as well. I feel that I've left Chris out a little bit, but I think the next set of questions is really towards Chris and Ringi. So let's talk about what investment products are currently available and how do we use them in client solutions. So Ringi, maybe you can just chat about what is available, and then Chris can maybe talk about how does one use these building blocks and solutions.
Sure. So I think there are a couple of ways to approach this. So we've seen green bonds rising in popularity globally over the past 10 years. And I think in South Africa as well, we've seen the issuance of green bonds picking up over a period of time. So what green bonds aim to do is actually ring fence the proceeds of those issuances. They call it a proceeds commitment, and target that to specific projects. So what we've seen is mainly an investment in renewable energy, but there's always an opportunity for issuers to broaden that. And I think what makes green bonds quite unique is typically they're listed. You have that use of proceeds commitment, and then they're also independently evaluated at inception and over a period of time. And so you get a little bit of liquidity there. I think in the South African markets, it's not that deep yet, but it's certainly growing and issuances are increasing. So we saw Nedbank issuing green bonds last year. DBSA also issued, although it was via private placement. But I think the key thing is that supply is not enough. Demand is always exceeding that supply, and these issuances have been oversubscribed. I think another avenue is investing in impact funds. So impact funds provide a really good answer to many of society's issues. I think in the past, there's been this perception that impact funds only give you impact returns, where that's not true at all. At Ashburton, we've got our Ashburton Credit Enhanced Funds, and these have a dual mandate. So you've got your financial return imperative, as well as your social return imperative. And what these funds aim to do is to provide benchmark beating returns, but at the same time addressing one of society's problems, specifically job creation. So over a period of time, the funds have a target job creation imperative, which they have exceeded over a period of time. And so these are really exciting solutions. And I think the good thing and the positive aspect of impact funds is that you are able to invest in a pool of assets. So you get a level of diversification there, as well as yield pickup from investing in smaller and growing entities that are creating these job opportunities.
Thanks, Ringi. So, Chris, let's get back to your client solution. We've spoken about renewable energy. We've spoken about broader infrastructure, impact, green bonds. How does one use this, and what is the benefit?
Yeah, so I think really good from a socially responsible perspective, we can sort of feel that this is what trustees want, this is what people are looking for, and I mean, it's quite important to take it forward. What's unique about some of these asset classes is they quite nicely meld into a pension fund requirement. So if you think of the investment horizon, some of these project finance loans that Ringi mentioned, amortized, that provide natural liquidity into the profile. And back to what Ringi said, they as long as the incentive is there for the financial reward, i.e. investors, the end members get paid for the risk they've taken on, I think it's actually quite an attractive opportunity. I think some of the hindrances that we may face is obviously the education. These are new asset classes, so a lot of effort needs to go into educating people, not just trustees, but asset managers on what the opportunities are, how these things behave. And the second thing is the delivery mechanism. So, we do sit in a world with regulations, and as Razia mentioned, they're adjusting regulations in Regulation 20 to try to accommodate this stuff, but we sort of have to meet them halfway. So how do we influence the market and how they distribute this stuff so that asset managers can participate? A very simple example is, if you go to an insurer and try to sell the stuff to them, do they want it listed? Do they want it rated? When you do these things, does it increase their appetite? Because if it increases their appetite, you sort of start to bring this, what we know is a demand, but a supply of funding together so that you can take it forward. And I think those are the main things that make these asset classes quite attractive for broad solution-based thinking in the institutional market.
Yeah, and I feel that we've actually made tremendous strides forward collectively in the last, call it 5-7 years already. I want to switch back. Thanks, Chris, for your comments. So I just want to switch back to your presentation, Chris, where we spoke earlier about how to achieve a more stable outcome in a volatile market. But Solly, maybe just to ask you in terms of your fund experience in terms of private market asset classes like private equity or venture capital, etc. Has it been good? Has it been bad?
It's been good. I think we went into the PE space some years ago, but unfortunately we went into Africa. We couldn't find PE practitioners in South Africa or who focused on South Africa a lot. So we've been doing well in Africa. Only recently we've allocated to a PE manager who focuses on South Africa and into the health space, like I said, into primary health care, into the outlying areas outside Gauteng. So far, the experience has been good. The only issue is maybe there's still not sufficient projects. The commitment is made, but the deployment takes too long to our our feeling. It takes too long. We feel like it's money lying there, not the managers not having sufficient projects to deploy the committed amounts to. But I think in general we're doing well. We also have some little bit of exposure to venture capital, but that's offshore. Again, we're struggling to get asset managers who can come to us with venture capital opportunities here at home. So maybe that's another opportunity that we can explore going forward.
So Chris, I think Solly is making a good point in terms of access and portfolio diversification in terms of pipeline, etc. So let's maybe chat about what are the challenges that we face in using private market assets, and how does one overcome it?
Yeah, I think so. If we go through your question, so some of the challenges are these assets are unique, so you do need quite a deep understanding of each individual investment that you're making, the characteristic, which is usually supported by a risk framework. So how do you invest in these things? That's quite important. And I think the other side to it is the sourcing. So, it's quite difficult to get access to these things as an investment manager. And I think you need to partner with the right stakeholders in order to provide yourself with access. Because if you're going to put these types of or the nature of these risks into a pensioner portfolio, an institutional mandate, you kind of need to have, again, the right pricing for it, which comes from the risk assessment bottom up, the right diversification in it, so that you can sort of ensure that stability of outcome over the long run.
Okay.
And lastly, the right stakeholder management, so you know exactly what's out there and you can sort of source what you need as and when you need it.
Cool. So if you can overcome those challenges or if you can address them, would you say the private market assets are useful? Do they have benefit for the client and for the end member?
Yeah, so I think as with any risk, if you can price it appropriately and make sure it's rewarded, that you're rewarded for your risk, and it's a different source than what you've got traditionally had access to, it always adds value. Because it doesn't just, as long as it's not just diversifying within itself, it diversifies your overall portfolio. And I think that's where the power comes from, but with those three criteria that I mentioned.
Yeah, I think what's really been good out of this discussion is about, can one address the member need, which is maybe a social need or an environmental need, but can one also achieve that stable return that one actually needs to, so that a member can ultimately retire comfortably. So I think that's been very good. I don't want us to run out of time. So I really want to thank all the speakers today on the panel, and I'd really like to thank you as the audience for making time to be with us today. Hopefully you found the presentations insightful. Please contact us if you've got any questions. Also be on the lookout for an email that's going to be coming through that will give you instructions on a Mr. D voucher that we're just sending out to everybody. And I really just want to ask you to thank you for your time and to have a great day. Please take care.